A Roman emperor killed in a bath by a gladiator. It sounds like fiction, a fever dream conjured from the edge of myth, yet it is bloody fact. The ruler of the most powerful empire on earth lies naked, helpless in warm water, murdered not on the battlefield or in a Senate ambush, but strangled by the very symbol of his vanity and downfall. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, self-proclaimed god-king of the arena, dies gasping on marble tile, not as a warrior, not as a statesman, but as a tyrant being choked by the very system he corrupted. Rome watches itself die in microcosm, its foundations cracking beneath one man's madness. And the man who kills him, a slave named Narcissus, a weapon forged in suffering and sharpened by oppression, rising not out of glory, but raw desperation. The sweat-slicked hands of the lowliest citizen crushing the throat of the highest power in the known world. This isn't merely an emperor's death. It's the moment the illusion of Rome's immortality shatters under the weight of one man's delusion. But how does a gladiator penetrate the imperial guard to kill an emperor with his bare hands? And what happens when the final breath of a god emperor sends tremors through an empire built on the myth of divine rule? To understand this final breath, we must start where Commodus's myth truly begins, within the echoing colonnades of the Colosseum, where blood is virtue and spectacle is law. Not content to sit in imperial luxury, Commodus strides into the arena himself, muscles oiled, sword gleaming, demanding worship not as emperor, but as Hercules reborn. The people do not cheer, they obey, terrified and transfixed as living history warps before their eyes. Day after day, he slaughters tethered beasts and handicapped gladiators, while the empire's coffers hemorrhage gold and senators grind their teeth to dust in silence. His performances are not games, but declarations of divine rule enforced through theatrical slaughter. Every swing of his blade screams a message, "I am Rome, and Rome will kneel." But across the empire, marble begins to crack. Provinces starve, legions whisper, generals exchange glances heavy with unspoken thoughts. Inside the palace, conspiracies germinate in shadows, because no empire survives when truth becomes treason and one man's delusion devours reality itself. In this collapsing theater of cruelty, Narcissus trains by guttering torchlight, muscles coiling like serpents beneath his skin, hands calloused to stone, rage distilled to cold purpose. While Commodus plays God, Narcissus becomes death. Two men, forged in the same corrupted fire, hurtling toward an inevitable collision where history will drown in a single marble bath. But Commodus was not always the mad god of the arena. He begins as a child, surrounded by war councils and Stoic philosophy, molded in the shadow of Marcus Aurelius, Rome's philosopher-emperor. Imagine it. Parchment maps stretched across blood-stained tables, the air thick with incense and battle plans, strategy humming like a second heartbeat through the imperial chambers. Young Commodus watches, not with reverence but calculation, as his father's calloused hands trace provincial borders with the same care he uses to write meditations on virtue. His father plants seeds of wisdom in that soft soil, but something alien grows instead, a hunger that twists beneath the surface. While Marcus kneels in mud beside dying soldiers contemplating the nature of mortality, Commodus dreams of thunderous applause and prostrating masses, seeing in power not responsibility, but entitlement. His education is impeccable, thorough in every Roman virtue, yet hollow at its core, corrupted by the whispers of sycophants promising divine birthright. The empire unknowingly crafts a weapon aimed at its own heart. The boy grows into a man whose muscles outpace his wisdom, eager to command rather than connect, to inspire fear instead of loyalty. When Marcus draws his final breath in 180 CE amid the fog-shrouded Danube frontier, Rome shivers not from winter, but foreboding. For the first time in generations, the empire passes not to the most worthy, but the most fortunate. power given rather than earned. Veterans who survived barbarian hordes now serve a man who has never bled for Rome. The experiment proves catastrophic. The Senate mourns in shadowed chambers. The Praetorian Guard tallies promised gold and a boy who fashioned himself. Hercules now wears imperial purple, his fingers already tightening around the throat of an empire no longer protected by philosophers or gods. But the arena is not enough. Power feeds on escalation, and in Commodus's mind, the divine throne must be vindicated with spectacle, not statecraft. He renames Rome after himself, Colonia Commodiana, desecrating centuries of tradition with petulant vanity. Statues rise across the empire, bearing his likeness, not with the scrolls of governance or laurels of victory, but clutching Hercules' club, lion skin draped over imperial shoulders, like a second skin grafted to festering incompetence. The Senate chamber becomes another stage, once proud patricians forced to grovel as gladiators, while nobles perform as slaves before crowds whose applause is choreographed by fear. His court transforms into a grotesque theater where truth becomes treason, flattery becomes currency, and every smile masks calculated betrayal. In shadowed alcoves of the Palatine Hill, Lucilla, his own sister and once the most powerful woman in Rome, weaves conspiracies with trembling hands, her eyes reflecting an empire disintegrating beneath her brother's madness. She fails catastrophically, sent into exile or executed, the historical record intentionally smudged by those who survived to write it. Commodus responds by tightening his grip until Rome gasps for breath. The imperial baths, once sanctuaries of Roman civility and political discourse, transform into labyrinthine chambers of whispers and suspicion, where steam carries rumors and blood might soon cloud the water. It is here, amid marble opulence and mounting dread, that Narcissus materializes not merely as a man, but as inevitable consequence, the physical manifestation of Rome's collective desperation. Day after day, the emperor trains with the gladiator who will become his executioner, blind to the lattice of scars mapping injustice across Narcissus's flesh, deaf to the silent tempest brewing behind his calculated subservience. Commodus believes he commands a trained weapon, but fails to recognize when that weapon begins targeting its wielder. He spars with what he thinks is a shadow, never grasping that shadows, when cornered by madmen who fancy themselves gods, learn precisely where gods can bleed. Beyond the marble walls of imperial fantasy, Rome itself begins to fracture like ancient pottery under unbearable weight. The legions, those battle-worn wolves guarding distant frontiers, no longer murmur but openly grumble, their legendary loyalty now purchasable with coin or maintainable only through fearful silence. Grain shipments from Egypt arrive sporadically, or not at all. Hunger riots flare along the banks of the Tiber, and whispers saturate every tavern and temple that the gods themselves have abandoned their once favored city. Within this crumbling monument to human ambition, a final desperate plan crystallizes, born not from noble ideology or courage, but from collective exhaustion. The Senate, neutered by years of executions, cannot act. The Praetorian Guard now protects only whoever provides the most gold. So the burden falls not to generals or statesmen, but to a man who still feels phantom chains around his wrists even after earning his position. Narcissus, the name itself an ironic prophecy, a man forced to stare at his reflection in the pools of blood he spills for others' entertainment. Once a nameless slave, he has been forged through suffering into a perfect instrument of death, carrying no army at his back, only the crushing weight of countless indignities witnessed in silence. When the conspirators finally approach him, they move with the careful reverence of priests before a dangerous altar. They offer no speeches, no appeals to forgotten virtue. They simply direct his gaze to the grotesque statue of Commodus as Hercules, to the palace corridors where whispered criticisms become death sentences, to a city suffocating under the weight of one man's delusion. Narcissus responds with a single, deliberate nod. No words are necessary. This truth he understands with terrible clarity. False gods are not killed in glorious battle with thunder cracking overhead. They die in quiet rooms on ordinary days, at the hands of men who have finally seen through the illusion and chosen to act. Commodus retreats into routine, shielded by madness masquerading as divine ritual. Each morning erupts with gladiatorial training, where sweat and spilled blood become sacraments to his delusion. Each night dissolves into narcotic stupor, his mind swimming through wine-dark dreams of applause and adoration. Between these poles of violence and escape, he issues paranoid decrees that remake Rome in his fractured image, ordering maps redrawn, statues recarved, rivals silently suffocated in midnight cells. He trusts nothing, not even his reflection, which shows not Hercules, but a mortal man with thinning hair and swollen features. Yet amid this spiral of suspicion, Narcissus remains, a silent constant in the whirlpool of betrayal that the palace has become. The gladiator moves through imperial chambers like a living shadow, muscles coiled beneath subservient gestures, eyes cataloguing every weakness while appearing to see nothing. To Commodus, he represents a harmless reflection of past glory, a loyal beast when all other animals bare their teeth behind closed doors. The emperor cannot recognize the executioner he himself has crafted, cannot sense the meticulous patience in those calloused hands that have memorized every vulnerability in his imperial flesh. Rome itself seems to hold its breath as the inevitable approaches. Then comes the final night. The city crouches beneath clouds heavy as burial shrouds, wind whispering through marble lattice like ancestral warnings from the underworld. Commodus sinks into his bath, limbs loose with wine and excess, steam rising from the water like spirits of those he condemned. Candles gutter in unseen draughts, casting ancient shadows across walls that have witnessed centuries of power and its dissolution. Footsteps approach, quiet as destiny on mosaic tiles. Narcissus emerges not as servant, not merely as assassin, but as judgment incarnate, the physical manifestation of Rome's collective vengeance. No theatrical declaration precedes what follows, no weapon gleams in torchlight, only bare hands, suddenly upon imperial flesh, crushing with terrible efficiency. The marble chamber amplifies the sounds of thrashing limbs, of water splashing violently across floors once walked by generals and kings. Commodus struggles, eyes bulging with the sudden comprehension of mortality, divine pretensions dissolving as quickly as breath in drowning lungs. He claws, he kicks, he tries to summon godhood in a room governed only by muscle and determined hatred. Narcissus remains silent throughout, face impassive as stone while his grip constricts with mechanical precision. The self-proclaimed Hercules dies not in glorious battle beneath open skies, but naked in a bath, strangled by hands, he himself strengthened through countless practice bouts. With Commodus's final shuddering gasp, centuries of imperial certainty dissolve like blood in warm water, leaving Rome suspended in the terrible freedom of what comes after God's fall. The corpse of Commodus lies crumpled beneath the still steaming surface, sunlight creeping through high windows to illuminate crimson tendrils dissolving in water that moments ago had cleansed an emperor. For a moment there is no empire, no senate, no rebellion, only the absolute silence that follows when tyranny exhales its final breath. The conspirators move with practiced urgency, wrapping the naked body in linen, navigating secret passages worn smooth by centuries of palace intrigue as coded messages race toward waiting generals. Outside these blood-stained walls, Rome stirs into morning rhythm, citizens haggling in marketplaces, priests performing rites, soldiers standing guard, all unconsciously participating in the final day of a dying era. But silence cannot contain such magnitude. By midday, rumors slither through the city like serpents, coiling around columns and slipping beneath doorways. The Praetorian Guard fractures instantly, their legendary discipline dissolving as they transform from protectors to power brokers, auctioning the empire to whoever might fill their coffers. The Senate chamber erupts in controlled panic as men who had cowered for years suddenly speak with borrowed courage, elevating the elderly Pertinax to purple robes still warm from their previous owner. And Narcissus, the instrument of Rome's liberation. His name already fades from official record, his execution mere weeks away, discarded like a blade too dangerous to keep after assassination. No monument will honor his hand, no poet will sing his courage. But something fundamental has ruptured in Rome's consciousness. The marble bath, where an emperor's lungs filled with water becomes sacred ground, not through reverence but terrible revelation. What dies that night is not merely Commodus, but the comforting fiction that emperors walk among gods. The question born in that steaming chamber seeps through every foundation stone of the empire. If divine rule can be strangled by mortal hands, then power itself is merely illusion maintained through collective belief. And once that belief fractures, even the mightiest empire becomes vulnerable to the truth that all thrones, no matter how ancient, rest not on divine right, but human tolerance. Years later, when historians attempt to stitch together the unraveling of an empire already rotting from within, they will speak of emperors and edicts, treaties and treacheries, but in quiet footnotes, the name Narcissus appears like a half-erased truth traced faintly beneath layers of imperial forgery. The bath, the hands, the silence all become myth, the kind whispered among slaves and soldiers rather than recorded in official chronicles. Yet its echo resonates through centuries with visceral power. Every Roman plaza where power is performed, every marble statue erected to yet another would-be immortal carries, somewhere beneath its polish, the ghost of that fatal bath. The water that once cradled imperial flesh becomes a silent testament, a reminder etched in steam and sinew that gods do not fall with thunderous proclamations. They drown in ordinary moments at the hands of those they rendered invisible. Power bleeds most profoundly when overlooked voices rise with terrible purpose. And in that final violent intimacy between emperor and gladiator, when calloused hands met vulnerable throat and delusion collided with flesh, Rome witnessed a truth it could never unsee. A single mortal shattered the divine illusion, not with legions at his command, not with senatorial decree, but with the raw determination of the oppressed. The empire would stumble forward for centuries more, bloodied and increasingly fragmented, its foundations cracking until its ruins fed the roots of kingdoms yet unborn. But Rome would never again truly believe its rulers divine, not in its collective soul. Because once, in the shadowed confines of an imperial bathhouse, a slave with scarred hands had proven otherwise, leaving behind not just a dead tyrant, but a mortal wound in the very concept of unchallenged authority. And so the story ends, not with a coronation or a conquest, but with a body sinking beneath steaming water, silence ringing louder than any triumph. The gods Commodus once imagined speaking through him now mock him in death, his name carved not in glory, but warning. That marble chamber remains, anonymous among imperial ruins, stones unknowing of the moment that redefined power itself. Rome continues, but fundamentally altered, the empire's foundations invisibly fractured in ways that will eventually bring its collapse. Each time history forgets the fragility of power, that bath steams again in collective memory, and Narcissus's hands reach once more from obscurity to remind us. Empire depends on magnificent myths carefully maintained, but myth dies when ordinary flesh dares confront false divinity. In that singular collision between gladiator and emperor, the bath becomes battlefield, the servant becomes executioner, and history pivots not to glorify the throne, but to witness its terrible vulnerability. The breath Commodus could not draw echoes eternally, not as defeat, but revelation, a gasping truth that shattered the mask of imperial invincibility. This remains his true legacy, not a reign but a rupture, a lesson scalding and unforgettable written in water turned crimson. The emperor drowned, and with him dissolved the ancient lie that rulers stand above mortality. And somewhere, buried beneath layers of ash, stone, and deliberate forgetting, that water still waits, dark and warm, for the next delusion to surrender its final truth, for the next mortal god to discover that power, no matter how vast, can be unmade by hands once thought insignificant. Time moves inexorably forward, but the echo of that fateful night lingers eternal. In sunlit forums throughout centuries to come, emperors still carve their likeness into marble. Their decrees still resound as stone weights drop onto parchment scrolls, sealing fates and fortunes. But Narcissus lingers too, a ghost buried in historical subtext, flickering behind the eyes of every citizen who dares question the divine right of rulers. His hands, never honored in official records, never forgiven by those who cling to power, become a whispered parable passed through shadows across centuries, from slave quarters to military barracks to secret gatherings of the disillusioned. Perhaps this erasure is fitting in its own way. Commodus had his countless statues and monuments. Narcissus had only silence. Yet it is precisely in this silence that the most dangerous truth survives, undiluted by propaganda, uncorrupted by official histories. The bath itself is long gone, the flesh of both men turned to dust, but every tyrant who follows now rules under the curse of that night, carrying the visceral knowledge that unseen hands may someday rise again when suffering reaches its breaking point. This remains the true legacy Commodus leaves in death, one not of glory or achievement, but of desecration and consequence, a cautionary tale etched into Rome's collective memory. And when empires forget this lesson, when they again mistake spectacle for sovereignty and theatrical performance for genuine power, they will hear the phantom splash of water from that ancient bath, and remember with sudden clarity that even gods, if built on arrogance alone, inevitably fall to silence in the righteous fury of bare hands. And so, as the dust of ages settles over shattered marble and forgotten corridors, the legend persists, not enshrined in triumphal arches or gilded tombs, but whispered in the cracks of time where true history survives. The tale of a gladiator who killed a god-king demands not belief, but visceral remembrance. For history belongs not merely to emperors with their edicts and monuments, but also to those whose names are deliberately erased, yet whose actions cut through centuries like molten iron through flesh. Narcissus never sought imperial purple, never commanded legions, never inscribed laws on tablets. But in one action, one final violent intimacy, born from accumulated suffering and calculated patience, he exposed the raw, trembling vulnerability at power's core. His hands, closing around divine flesh, shattered not just a tyrant's windpipe, but the comforting delusion that authority exists beyond human judgment. In that bathing chamber, amid steam rising like ghosts of Rome's forgotten victims, the most fundamental truth of civilization was laid bare. Empire is not inevitable, tyranny not unassailable, and even the most exalted gods bleed and drown when confronted by those they once forced to kneel. Rome would rise and fall again through centuries, other tyrants would claim divine right, but that moment in heated water, when mortality asserted itself through strangling fingers, became the silent current running beneath all power structures built thereafter. The water cools, the blood disperses, but the lesson burns eternal, carried in the knowing glances between the oppressed when rulers claim immortality. In the end, history does not interrogate the moral complexities of Narcissus or the deserved fate of Commodus, or whether Rome's decline was preventable. What echoes through millennia, despite deliberate erasure, is that singular confrontation when spectacle surrendered to silence, when imperial delusions drowned in bathwater suddenly stilled. This was neither codified justice nor organized rebellion, but something far more primal, the visceral act of one forgotten man reaching through layers of tyranny to tear power from hands that believe themselves divinely protected. And somewhere today, when a ruler glimpses their reflection wavering in water, when a voice rises unexpectedly from society's margins, that ancient tremor awakens. The imperial bath was dismantled, its marble repurposed, its chamber entombed beneath centuries of successive empires. But the truth persists not in official records, but in collective memory, encoded in our very bones. A mortal can destroy a god. A gladiator can extinguish an emperor. The seemingly invincible center can shatter. And when it does, humanity watches transfixed, not merely to witness who collapses, but to remember with terrible clarity that anyone, at any time, might suddenly rise with purpose against unchecked power. So let monuments crumble and scrolls fade. Let tyrants rewrite their legacies and bathe in imagined eternity. Because beneath every empire's grandeur lies a fragile truth, waiting. It waits not in the echo of triumph, but in the silence that follows when power fails to see its reckoning taking shape just beyond the torchlight. It waits in the quiet heartbeat of a single life trained to obey, yet daring to defy. In the end, the bath becomes not just the scene of one emperor's pathetic demise, but the crucible where myth meets mortality, where steam carries the last breath of false godhood. In that place, forged in vapor and vengeance, the soul of Rome was forever altered, not by sword, not by senate, not by proclamation, but by the unyielding grip of a gladiator who reminded the world that no god, no matter how loudly he proclaims his divinity, is beyond the reach of human hands. That truth, whispered in steam and silence, carved into wet marble and memory, endures when all statues have crumbled and all imperial decrees have turned to dust. It survives in the instinctive shiver that passes through all tyrants when they glimpse their own reflections wavering in still water, when they suddenly remember that divinity itself can be strangled by the hands of those they once thought insignificant. And perhaps that is the final, most unbearable irony for those who crave eternal rule, that their downfall is not written in the thunderclap of rebellion or carved by the blades of conquering legions, but whispered in the steam of a private chamber by fingers once commanded to kneel. It is not crowns that define legacies, but the stories told in shadowed corners, passed from generation to generation with trembling urgency. The tale of Narcissus stands not as tragedy nor triumph, but as proof, immutable and searing, that no illusion of divinity survives the steady pressure of truth applied by mortal hands. When emperors mistake fear for loyalty, when they believe their own mythology too completely, the ghost of that marble bath waits, patient as death itself, for history to repeat its blood-stained revelation. For power, stripped of its ornaments and pretensions, is merely flesh against flesh, and even gods drown when the water rises above their lips.